Some people don't raise their voice, they raise the standard. The restaurant glowed under soft amber lights, crystal glasses catching reflections like quiet stars, the kind of place where a single dinner could cost more than a month's rent and nobody blinked. And at table 12, Khalid al-Rashid leaned back in his chair with the effortless confidence of a man who had never been told no. His tailored suit sharp, his watch worth more than the car parked outside, his presence bending the room without trying, while across from him sat investors who laughed a little too quickly, nodded a little too often, men who understood power when they saw it and adjusted themselves accordingly, and moving between them all like she didn't belong, but somehow completely in control, was Emily Carter, her black uniform simple, her hair tied back, her expression calm in a way that didn't ask for attention, didn't need it. She carried a tray with steady hands, refilling water glasses, adjusting silverware that didn't need adjusting, noticing details no one else cared to see, like the slight smudge on a wine glass, like the misprint on a receipt written in a language most of the room wouldn't recognize. And when she placed the check folder down near Khalid, something unusual happened. He didn't open it, didn't even glance at it. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a crisp stack of bills, and set it on the table with a soft, deliberate tap. $10,000 in clean, quiet weight. Enough to turn heads, enough to buy silence. And he smiled, not cruelly, but with the kind of casual dismissal that felt worse, the kind that assumed understanding without explanation. Then he spoke, not in English, but in Arabic, fluid, confident, the rhythm of someone who knew exactly who could and couldn't follow along. And the men at the table responded in kind, laughter rising, a private conversation in plain sight. And though no one translated, no one needed to. The tone said enough. The glance toward Emily said the rest. She stood there for half a second longer than necessary, just enough for someone observant to notice, just enough for something to register beneath the surface. But then, she nodded slightly, professional, composed, as if nothing had happened at all, as if the words hadn't been about her, as if she hadn't understood every single one. And she turned away, walking toward the service station, her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged, blending back into the quiet rhythm of the room. While behind her the conversation continued, Khalid speaking again in Arabic, this time slower, almost playful, as if testing the air, as if enjoying the invisible barrier he believed separated him from everyone else. A language used not just to communicate, but to control, to exclude, to remind the room exactly where he stood. And for a moment, it worked. The power sat firmly in his hands, unchallenged, unquestioned, absolute. Until Emily stopped at the counter, picked up a pen, and without hesitation corrected a single word on a printed invoice, in flawless Arabic script, before placing it back exactly where it had been, unnoticed by everyone except the one person who mattered, because Khalid's eyes flicked up at just the wrong moment, catching something he wasn't supposed to see, something small, something precise, something that didn't fit the story he had already decided was true. And for the first time that evening, his smile paused, just slightly, just long enough for the balance in the room to shift, though no one else felt it yet, not even him. He did not speak right away, but he did not look away either. Khalid's gaze lingered on the counter where the invoice had been adjusted, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, as if something invisible had just shifted beneath them, a detail too small for anyone else to notice, yet too precise to ignore. And for the first time that evening, he leaned forward instead of back, his attention no longer scattered across the room, but focused, deliberate, calculating, while the men around him continued their conversation unaware, discussing numbers, percentages, projections that sounded impressive but meant little without clarity. And Khalid listened, but only halfway, because part of his mind had already moved elsewhere, replaying that brief moment, the curve of unfamiliar script corrected with confidence, not guessed, not copied, but known. And across the room, Emily continued working as if nothing had happened, refilling a glass here, clearing a plate there, her movements steady, unhurried, her face neutral, revealing nothing. And that bothered him more than anything else, not the possibility that she understood, but the certainty that she did not care to prove it. And after a few seconds that stretched longer than they should have, he spoke again in Arabic, this time softer, more precise, choosing his words carefully, no longer careless, no longer for show, but for confirmation, and he said, "It is amusing how easily people pretend to understand things beyond their reach." His tone smooth, almost conversational, but his eyes did not leave her, and Emily paused, just slightly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to acknowledge the shift. Then she turned, walked back toward the table, and placed a fresh glass of water in front of him with the same quiet professionalism as before, but this time, she did not step away immediately. Instead, she adjusted the placement of his fork by less than an inch, a detail so small it bordered on invisible. And then, without raising her voice, without changing her expression, she answered in Arabic, her pronunciation clean, her rhythm natural. "Sometimes people do not pretend, sir. Sometimes they simply choose not to interrupt." And the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. The conversation at the table faltered. One of the investors stopped mid-sentence. Another glanced between them as if trying to confirm what he had just heard, and Khalid's hand stilled completely. The faint smile he carried dissolving into something sharper, something more attentive, because this was no longer a coincidence, no longer a curiosity. This was a disruption, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them holding something unspoken, something balanced on the edge of change, until one of the men across the table let out a small, uncertain laugh, as if attempting to restore the normal order of things. But it did not land the same way it had before, not with her standing there, not with the language no longer acting as a barrier but as a bridge she controlled just as easily as he did. And Khalid finally exhaled, slow, measured, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger but in recognition. The kind that comes when a story you believe begins to unravel in front of you. And for the first time that night, he did not look at her like part of the background. He looked at her like a question he had not planned to ask. The room did not return to normal, not completely. Even as conversations tried to resume and glasses were lifted again, something subtle had shifted, like a note slightly out of tune that no one could unhear, and Khalid leaned back slowly. But this time it was not with ease, it was with intent. His fingers steepled lightly in front of him as he studied Emily with a new kind of focus, not dismissive, not amused, but precise. The way a man examines a detail that does not fit into his carefully constructed world. And he spoke again in Arabic, quieter now, controlled, each word chosen with care. "Where did you learn that?" And Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her posture straight, her expression calm, and she answered just as simply. "In a classroom, like most people." And there was no edge in her voice, no attempt to impress, just a statement, clean and complete. And one of the investors shifted in his seat, glancing between them as if sensing that the conversation had moved beyond business into something less predictable, and Khalid's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement, and he said, "Your accent is not academic." And for the first time, something almost like warmth flickered in Emily's eyes, not softness, but recognition of the observation, and she adjusted a glass on the table before replying, "Neither is yours." And the silence that followed was different from before, not tense, not awkward, but aware, as if both of them had stepped into a space where the usual rules no longer applied. And Khalid let out a quiet breath that could have been a laugh if it had carried more sound, but it did not. It stayed contained, measured, and he shifted his attention briefly to the documents spread across the table. A contract filled with clauses and translations that had been discussed for the past 20 minutes without resolution, numbers that did not align, terms that had been debated back and forth with growing frustration. And he tapped one line lightly with his finger, then looked back at Emily. "Since you understand the language, perhaps you can explain why this clause keeps being misunderstood." And it was not a request, not exactly, but it was no longer a command either, and Emily glanced down at the document, her eyes scanning the text quickly, efficiently, as if she had seen something like it before, and she did not reach for it, did not ask to sit. She simply read, standing there, and after a brief pause, she spoke, still in Arabic, her tone even. "It is not misunderstood, it is mistranslated." And one of the investors frowned, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" And Emily shifted her gaze slightly, including the table now, not just Khalid, and she pointed to a single word, "this." term does not mean what you think it means in this context. It changes the obligation entirely. And Khaled's expression sharpened, his attention fully locked in now, and he asked, "Explain." And Emily did, calmly, clearly, breaking down the phrasing, the nuance, the implication hidden within a single line that had gone unnoticed. And as she spoke, the room grew quieter again, not because of shock this time, but because of understanding, the kind that settles in slowly, undeniable. And when she finished, there was no immediate response, just a pause that carried weight. And Khaled looked at the document, then back at her, and for the first time that evening, he nodded, not out of politeness, but out of recognition. And in that small, almost imperceptible gesture, the balance shifted again, this time completely. No one spoke for a few seconds after she finished, not because they did not understand, but because they understood too clearly, the kind of clarity that made previous confidence feel misplaced. And one of the investors leaned back slowly, exhaling under his breath as he looked again at the contract, this time with different eyes, while another adjusted his glasses, rereading the same line that had been discussed for nearly half an hour without resolution. And Khaled remained still, his gaze fixed on the page, but his mind had already moved past it, calculating, recalibrating, tracing the implications of what she had just revealed, because it was not a small detail, it was structural. It changed leverage, responsibility, outcome, and after a moment, he closed the folder halfway, not fully, just enough to signal a pause, and he said in English this time, his voice steady, "If what you are saying is correct, this agreement shifts risk entirely onto my side." And Emily did not rush to answer. She simply nodded once, precise, and replied, "Yes, sir, it does." And there was no hesitation, no softening, just fact. And one of the men across the table let out a quiet whistle before catching himself, glancing at Khaled as if unsure whether that reaction was acceptable. But Khaled did not react to him. His attention remained on Emily, and he asked, "And you saw this?" "Immediately," and she answered. "It was written clearly, just not in the way you were reading it." And that landed differently than anything else she had said, not confrontational, not defensive, but undeniable. And Khaled's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, controlled movement, then stopped, and he leaned back again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if allowing the moment to settle fully before responding. And when he did, his tone had changed, not dramatically, but enough. The sharp edge replaced with something more measured, more aware. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the empty chair beside the table. And it was not a demand, not quite an invitation either. More like an adjustment of position, an acknowledgement that the dynamic had shifted and needed to be addressed accordingly. And Emily glanced at the chair briefly, then back at him, and for a moment it seemed like she might decline. But instead she moved the chair slightly, not sitting fully, just enough to be level with the table, maintaining that subtle distance that had defined her presence from the beginning. And Khaled watched that carefully, noting what she did not do as much as what she did, and he slid the contract toward her, then explained the rest. And the room quieted again, not out of tension, but out of attention, because now they were not watching a waitress anymore. They were watching someone who understood something they did not. And Emily placed her hand lightly on the edge of the document, her fingers steady, her posture unchanged, and she began, not quickly, not slowly, but with a rhythm that matched the complexity of the text, breaking it down line by line, clarifying intent, correcting assumptions. And as she spoke, the conversation transformed, no longer scattered opinions but structured understanding. And Khaled listened, truly listened, his eyes following her explanations, his questions becoming sharper, more precise, not testing her, but engaging with her. And for the first time that evening, the power at the table did not come from who spoke the loudest or who controlled the room. It came from who understood the truth beneath the words. And in that space, Emily was no longer invisible. The conversation no longer felt like a service interaction. It felt like a negotiation room that had quietly rearranged itself around a new center of gravity. And Emily continued speaking with the same calm precision, her voice steady, her words measured, never rushed, never forced, as she moved from one clause to the next, unraveling layers that had been overlooked not because they were hidden, but because no one had taken the time to truly read them. And Khaled followed every word, his Posture slightly forward now, his attention anchored, no longer divided between status and outcome, but fixed entirely on understanding. And one of the investors leaned in closer, placing his hand over the document as if grounding himself in the reality of what was being explained, while another shook his head slowly, murmuring, "We missed all of this," under his breath, not as a complaint, but as a realization. And Emily did not react to their comments. She did not look for validation. She simply continued, pointing to a section near the bottom of the page. "This part here," she said, her tone unchanged. "It appears neutral, but it creates a secondary obligation once the initial terms are activated." And Khalid's eyes narrowed slightly, not in skepticism, but in concentration. "Which means?" he asked, and Emily answered without pause. "It means you are committing to conditions that the other party can interpret more broadly than you intend, and once signed, you cannot dispute it without legal exposure." And the weight of that settled immediately, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable, like a door quietly closing behind a decision that could not be undone. And Khalid leaned back again, slower this time, his gaze shifting briefly away from the document as if recalculating everything that had led to this moment, then returning to her, sharper, more focused than before, and he said, "Why did no one else see this?" Not accusing, not defensive, but genuinely asking. And Emily paused for the first time since she began explaining, just long enough to consider the question, then she replied, "Because everyone was reading to confirm what they expected, not to understand what was written." And that answer landed deeper than any technical explanation, because it was not about language anymore. It was about perspective, and Khalid let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, more like recognition of something he had not been forced to confront in a long time. And he glanced around the table, at the men who had been advising him, who now sat in thoughtful silence, their earlier confidence replaced with careful attention, and then his gaze returned to Emily, steady, assessing, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the air holding a new kind of respect, unspoken but present. And Khalid reached for the stack of bills he had placed on the table earlier, the $10,000 that had once represented control, dismissal, distance, and he slid it slightly toward her, not as a command, not as a test, but as an offering. And Emily looked at it briefly, then back at him, her expression unchanged, her posture still, and she said, quietly, "I did not do this for that." And she did not push it away, she did not take it. She simply let the statement exist, clear and complete, and Khalid studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once, slowly, and in that small gesture, something fundamental shifted, not just in how he saw her, but in how the entire room understood what had just happened. For a moment, nothing moved. The money remained on the table, untouched, no longer a symbol of control, but something uncertain, almost out of place, and Khalid did not pull it back immediately. He simply looked at it, then at her, as if reassessing not just the situation, but the assumptions that had led him there. And the room held that silence carefully, no one interrupting, no one attempting to restore the earlier rhythm, because it no longer applied. And Emily shifted her hand slightly away from the document, not retreating, just signaling that she had said what needed to be said, her role complete whether anyone acknowledged it or not. And Khalid finally reached forward, not to take the money back, but to close the folder completely this time, the soft sound of paper meeting leather marking a quiet decision. And he said, in English, his voice lower than before, more deliberate, "If you had not spoken, I would have signed this tonight." And Emily met his gaze evenly. "Yes, sir," she replied, and there was no pride in her tone, no attempt to emphasize what that meant, just truth. And Khalid nodded once, absorbing that fully. Then he leaned back and exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting for a brief moment toward the rest of the restaurant, the soft lighting, the distant conversations, the illusion of normalcy that now felt slightly altered. And when his attention returned, it was sharper, more grounded, and he asked, "Why are you working here?" And it was not the kind of question people usually asked in that setting. Not small talk, not curiosity dressed as politeness. It was direct, almost personal. And for the first time, Emily did not answer immediately. Her eyes flickered down for just a second, then back up, and she said, "Because it pays the bills." Simple, complete, and Khalid studied her, recognizing the boundary in that answer, the line she had drawn without raising her voice. And instead of pushing past it, he nodded slightly, accepting it for what it was, and one of the investors cleared his throat quietly, glancing between them before speaking. We should revise the terms before proceeding. His tone careful now, respectful in a way it had not been earlier, and Khalid did not look at him right away, his attention still on Emily, and then he said, "We will," before turning his gaze back to the table, and something subtle had changed in the way he spoke, not weaker, not uncertain, but more precise, as if the need to prove authority had been replaced with the need to apply it correctly, and Emily stepped back slightly from the table, creating that quiet distance again, her presence no longer central but still felt, like a note that lingered even after the music had shifted, and Khalid reached for a pen, then paused, his hand hovering just above the surface, and instead of signing, he placed it down, deliberately, and said, "We rewrite this from the beginning." And the men around him nodded without hesitation, no debate, no resistance, just agreement, because the direction was now clear. And Khalid glanced once more at Emily, not with curiosity this time, not with surprise, but with something closer to respect, and he said, "Stay." A single word, not commanding, not forceful, but weighted with acknowledgement, and Emily considered it for a brief second, then gave a small nod, not as an employee, not as someone following an order, but as someone choosing to remain, and in that quiet exchange, the roles in the room settled into something entirely new. The table no longer belonged to one man. It belonged to the truth laid out across its surface, and as the new draft began to take shape, the energy in the room shifted from performance to precision. Papers were adjusted, notes were rewritten, and voices that once filled the space with certainty now moved carefully, choosing words with intention, while Emily stood just close enough to be part of the process, yet far enough to never claim ownership of it, her presence steady, unobtrusive, but undeniably central. And Khalid watched her more than the document now, not constantly, not obviously, but in brief, calculated glances, as if trying to understand how someone could step into a room like this, alter its direction completely, and then remain unchanged by it. And after several minutes of quiet revision, one of the investors spoke again, his tone different from before, no longer leading, but confirming, "This version aligns with the original intent." And Khalid nodded once, his attention still divided between the page and the person who had made that alignment possible, and he asked, without looking up, "What would you change next?" And the question was not directed at the table, it was directed at her. And Emily stepped slightly closer, her eyes scanning the updated text, her mind moving quickly but her demeanor unchanged, and she pointed to a paragraph near the end. "This section is clearer, but the language is still open to interpretation," she said, her voice even, and Khalid followed her indication immediately. "How would you close it?" he asked, and she paused briefly, considering not just the words, but their weight, then answered, "Define the limitation directly, do not imply it." And one of the men picked up his pen instantly, writing as she spoke, no hesitation, no debate, just action, and the room accepted her input without question now, not because of her position, but because of her accuracy, and Khalid leaned back again, observing this shift fully, the way authority had quietly relocated from title to clarity, and after another few minutes, the revised agreement sat complete, not perfect, but understood, and that difference mattered more than anything else, and Khalid reached for the pen again, this time without pause, signing his name with a steady hand, not rushed, not hesitant. And when he finished, he placed the pen down gently, the sound soft but final, and the men around him exchanged brief looks, subtle nods, the kind that acknowledged not just the deal, but the process that had led to it. And Khalid closed the folder once more, then looked up at Emily fully, not as a passing glance, but directly, and he said, "You saw what 5 of us did not," his tone calm, but weighted with recognition, and Emily did not respond immediately. She simply met his gaze, her expression unchanged, then said, "You were not looking for it," and there was no accusation in her voice, only clarity, and Khalid held that for a moment, then nodded slowly, accepting it without defense. And in that quiet exchange, something settled between them, not agreement, not familiarity, but respect, the kind that does not need to be announced. And as the others began to gather their papers, preparing to move forward, Khalid remained seated for a second longer, his attention still fixed on her, as if the conversation was not finished, even though the contract was. The movement around the table resumed. Chairs shifted back, documents were gathered into neat stacks, and quiet conversations began again. But they no longer carried the same tone. There was less certainty, more awareness, as if everyone present had just witnessed something they could not easily explain. And Emily stepped back fully now, returning to the role she had never truly left, her hands light, her posture composed. The distance between her and the table restored, yet nothing about her presence felt smaller. If anything, it felt more defined. And Khalid remained seated for a moment longer than the others, his fingers resting against the closed folder, his gaze following her as she moved away, not out of curiosity anymore, but with intention, as if deciding something that extended beyond the contract they had just finalized. And when he finally stood, the room adjusted again, not dramatically, just subtly, the way people do when someone used to lead without question begins to move differently. And he turned slightly, his voice cutting through the soft background noise. "Emily," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough to reach her, and she paused, turning back with the same calm expression, the same steady gaze. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them holding something unspoken, something that did not need to be rushed. And Khalid took a step closer, not invading, just closing the distance enough to be heard without raising his voice. And he said, "You changed the outcome of this deal tonight." And Emily tilted her head slightly, not dismissing the statement, but not accepting it as praise either. "I clarified what was already there," she replied, her tone even. And Khalid nodded once, acknowledging the distinction, because he understood now that what she offered was not performance, it was precision, and that could not be bought, not the way he was used to buying solutions. And his eyes flicked briefly to the stack of bills still resting on the table behind him, untouched, then back to her, and he said, "Most people would have taken that." And Emily followed his glance for just a second, then returned her attention to him. "Most people were not asked to ignore themselves," she said quietly, and that landed deeper than anything else that had been said that night, because it was not about money, not about language, it was about choice. And Khalid absorbed that without interruption, his expression shifting slightly, not into discomfort, but into understanding. And he reached into his jacket again, not for money this time, but for a card, simple, clean, with nothing excessive about it. And he held it out to her, not pushing it forward, just offering it. "If you ever decide that this is not where you belong," he said, his voice steady, "call me." And Emily looked at the card, then at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she took it, not eagerly, not reluctantly, just deliberately, as if accepting a possibility rather than a promise. And she nodded once. "Thank you," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, just acknowledgement. And Khalid gave a small nod in return, then stepped back, not lingering, not extending the moment further than it needed to be, because he understood now that respect did not require repetition. And as he turned to leave with the others, the space he had occupied earlier felt different, less dominant, more grounded. And Emily slipped the card into her apron pocket, not looking at it again, not yet. And she turned back to the restaurant floor, picking up a tray, adjusting a glass, moving through the room with the same quiet rhythm as before, unchanged on the surface. But for those who had been watching closely, everything about the room had shifted, not because she had spoken loudly, but because she had spoken when it mattered. The restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm. Glasses clinked softly. Low conversations filled the air again, and the moment that had shifted everything seemed to dissolve into the quiet hum of another evening. But not completely, not for those who had seen it, because something subtle remained, something that could not be undone. And Emily moved through the space with the same steady pace, the same calm presence, her hands precise, her attention focused, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. And yet, every step carried a quiet certainty, the kind that did not need recognition to exist. And as she passed table 12 again, now cleared, now empty, her eyes rested on the spot where the folder had been, where the money had sat, where the balance had shifted, and she did not pause, not visibly, but something in her gaze acknowledged it, then moved on, because for her, it had never been about the table, or the man, or the moment. It had been about the standard she carried long before anyone noticed, and in the kitchen doorway, another server leaned toward her, curiosity barely contained. "What was that about?" she whispered, glancing toward the exit where Khalid and his group had disappeared, and Emily gave a small, almost amused breath, not quite a laugh. "Just a conversation," she said, her tone light, but not dismissive, and she picked up another order ticket, scanning it quickly, already back in motion, already grounded in the present, and outside, the city carried on, traffic, lights changing, engines humming, people moving with purpose or without it, and Khalid stood beside his car for a brief moment before getting in, his hand resting on the door handle, his mind not on the deal he had just secured, not on the numbers or the signatures, but on something far quieter, far more precise, a voice that had not raised itself yet had redirected everything. And he looked back once, not expecting to see her, not needing to, but acknowledging that something rare had occurred, something he could not replicate with influence or wealth. And then he got into the car, the door closing with a soft, final sound, and inside, Emily reached into her apron pocket as she walked, her fingers brushing against the card, feeling its edges without taking it out. Not yet, not in that moment, because decisions like that were not made in the middle of a shift, not made in reaction, but in clarity, and she left it there, continuing forward, serving, observing, existing exactly where she chose to be. And as the night moved on, no one in the room spoke about what had happened, not directly. But the way they spoke to her changed, slightly, subtly, a fraction more attentive, a fraction more aware, and she noticed it. Of course she did, but she did not react to it, because respect that comes from a moment can fade, but respect that comes from consistency stays, and she had never relied on the first, only the second, and somewhere between one table and the next, between one quiet exchange and another, the truth settled into the space without announcement, without ceremony, just presence. That intelligence does not need to prove itself loudly, and dignity does not ask for permission to exist. And sometimes, the most powerful shift in a room happens not when someone speaks the most, but when they choose the exact moment to speak at all.